The Vindication drifted through the void like a dying ember, its hull scarred by plasma burns and meteor impacts that told the story of humanity's final chapter. Captain Zerion Vex stood on the bridge, watching the last funeral pyre of Earth's colonies fade in the rear sensors. Behind them, the hegemony's Crimson Fleet had reduced 14 worlds to radioactive glass in a systematic extermination that had taken 3 brutal years. "Sir, we're receiving distress signals from Kepler 442b, reported Navigation Officer Nirix Cade, her voice hollow. The weight of being sole survivors pressed down on the bridge crew like a physical force. "The orbital platforms were under siege when the signal cut out." Zerion's weathered hands gripped the command rail. At 63, he'd witnessed humanity's golden age of expansion, commanded fleets that explored distant galaxies, and now presided over their extinction. The Vindication carried 12,000 souls, engineers, scientists, children, artists, the final genetic and cultural repository of a species that once spread across 47 star systems. "Helm, set course for the Hegemony forward staging base at Proxima Tertius," Zerion commanded, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had kept his crew together through impossible odds. Chief Engineer Kayvon Drex looked up from his console, oil-stained fingers pausing over the reactor diagnostics. "Captain, we're running on fumes. The quantum drive is operating at 30% efficiency, and our antimatter reserves won't sustain another major engagement. Then we'll make it count." Zerion turned to face his assembled senior staff. These weren't just officers anymore. They were the last guardians of human memory. "The Hegemony thinks they've won. They've celebrated our extinction across their empire, declared the galaxy cleansed of the human infection. But they've made one critical error." Tactical Officer Rin, Torch leaned forward, her cybernetic eye interfacing directly with the weapons array. "What's that, sir?" "They left one ship intact." Zerion's smile held no warmth, only the cold mathematics of vengeance. "And that ship happens to carry every military secret, every technological advancement, every strategic protocol that made humanity the most feared warrior species in 3 sectors." The bridge fell silent, except for the hum of dying systems. Outside the viewports, the stars seemed to lean in, waiting to witness what would come next. Dr. Elisa Vorn, the ship's xenobiologist and one of the last academic minds of her species, spoke carefully. "Captain, what you're proposing, it would mean abandoning any hope of finding sanctuary. We could establish a colony somewhere in the Andromeda spiral, rebuild slowly." "Rebuild for what?" Zerion's voice carried the pain of watching children incinerated on colony worlds, of rescue ships arriving to find nothing but ash and silence. "So the Hegemony can hunt us down again in 50 years? So other species can suffer what we've endured?" He activated the ship's intercom, his words reaching every corridor, every family huddled in refugee quarters, every survivor who'd lost everything. "Citizens of the Vindication, this is your captain. We stand at a crossroads. We can fade quietly into the dark, or we can remind the galaxy why humanity was feared, respected, and ultimately targeted for extinction. The choice is yours." Response came not in words, but in actions. Throughout the ship, survivors began moving with purpose. Engineers headed to weapons bays. Families gathered to record final messages. Children too young to understand drew pictures of home to upload into the ship's permanent memory banks. Humanity's last ship turned toward enemy space, carrying with it the accumulated rage of an exterminated species. 3 weeks into their suicide mission, the Vindication had become something unprecedented in galactic warfare. A ghost ship that struck without warning and vanished before retaliation arrived. The Hegemony's first indication that humanity's extinction might have been prematurely celebrated came when their mining station at Vega 7 simply disappeared from all sensor networks. "How does a facility with 40,000 workers just vanish?" demanded Admiral Kexthan Mollix, the hegemony's supreme military commander, as he reviewed the reports in his flagship Dominion's Edge. His 6 arms gestured frantically at the holographic displays showing nothing but empty space where a major deuterium processing plant had operated for 2 centuries. Captain Zerion studied the tactical display from the Vindication's modified war room, watching hegemony patrol routes shift in response to their latest strike. Chief Engineer Kayvon had outdone himself, integrating human stealth technology with salvaged alien components in ways that violated several laws of physics. The ship could now phase partially out of normal space-time, becoming effectively invisible to conventional sensors. "They're adapting faster than expected," observed Commander Nexus Blade, the ship's intelligence officer. Her neural implants processed hegemony communications in real time, translating their growing panic into actionable intelligence. "They've increased patrol density by 400% and implemented new scanning protocols designed specifically to detect us." Zerion nodded, studying the enemy formations. "Good. Fear makes them predictable." The next phase of their campaign began at the industrial world of Kepler 186F, where the hegemony manufactured the plasma weapons used to glass human colonies. The Vindication dropped out of phase space directly inside the planet's orbital shipyards, its modified weapons array already charging. Rin Torch's targeting systems had been enhanced with human psychological warfare algorithms. Instead of simply destroying the facilities, she systematically eliminated life support to the worker habitats first, broadcasting emergency signals that drew rescue ships into predetermined kill zones. The psychological impact rippled through hegemony space faster than their propaganda networks could contain it. "They're calling us the Death Shadow," reported Nexus, monitoring enemy communications. "Their military psychologists estimate we've created terror effects equivalent to a fleet of 500 vessels." Dr. Elisa Vorn worked tirelessly in the ship's modified laboratories, developing new forms of warfare that blended human creativity with desperate innovation. Her latest creation, nanoscale machines that could survive in vacuum and systematically dismantle molecular bonds in ship hulls, had turned 3 hegemony battle groups into expanding clouds of metallic dust. But victory came with a price that grew heavier each day. The ship's population had fallen to 11,200 as volunteer crews piloted modified shuttles on one-way missions behind enemy lines. Each loss was recorded in the memorial hall that Dr. Vorn had established in the ship's central plaza, where the names of the dead were etched into crystalline matrices that would survive the heat death of the universe. "We can't sustain this." "Operational tempo," Kayvon warned during their daily command briefing. His engineering reports painted a grim picture. Critical systems failing, irreplaceable components jury-rigged with materials never intended for their purpose. "The quantum phase drive is consuming itself from the inside out. Best estimate, we have maybe 6 more phase jumps before catastrophic failure." Zerion absorbed this information without visible reaction. He'd expected this moment, planned for it. Then we move to the final phase. "Signal all department heads. We begin preparation for Operation Last Song." The ship's senior staff exchanged glances. They'd discussed theoretical scenarios for a final strike, but none had expected it to come so soon. "Sir," Rin spoke carefully, "Operation Last Song isn't a military mission. It's a statement. Once we initiate, there's no going back, no possibility of survival." "There was never going to be survival," Zerion replied quietly. "Only the choice of how our species would be remembered." Throughout the ship, families began recording their final messages to the universe. Scientists compiled their discoveries into compressed data packets, and artists created works that captured the essence of human experience. These would be humanity's true weapons, not the plasma cannons or phase drives, but the ideas, dreams, and stubborn defiance that had carried them across the galaxy. The Vindication set course for the hegemony capital system, carrying with it the accumulated fury of a species that refused to die quietly. The capital world of Thexmore had never known the touch of war, For 3,000 years, it had stood as the jewel of the hegemony empire, its crystalline spires reaching toward twin suns that bathed the world in perpetual golden light. The planet's defense grid consisted of orbital platforms that could sterilize entire solar systems, supported by the largest fleet concentration in known space. None of it mattered when the Vindication phased directly through the outer defensive. Shell and materialized inside the inner system like a fever dream made manifest. Emperor Vex Thon Ultrax received the impossible reports while holding court in the Eternal Throne Chamber, surrounded by representatives from 47 subjugated species. The human ship, the last remnant of a supposedly extinct civilization, had somehow bypassed defenses that had never been breached in recorded history. Impossible, he rasped through his translator matrix, his 4 hearts beating in staccato rhythm. Our scientists confirmed the human extinction. We have biological samples. We witnessed their worlds burn. We cataloged every ship destroyed. Admiral Kexthan Mollix materialized via hologram, his usual composure shattered. Your Imperial Magnitude, the human vessel has already eliminated 12 orbital platforms using weapons we cannot classify. Our energy shields are ineffective. Their attacks seem to bypass conventional physics entirely. On the Vindication's bridge, Captain Zerion watched the massive enemy fleet scramble to respond to their presence. The hegemony's panic was almost beautiful. Formations breaking apart as commanders received contradictory orders, ships colliding as they attempted desperate intercept courses. Phase coherence at 18% and falling, reported Kavon from his engineering station. The quantum drive's exotic matter containment fields flickered ominously, casting rainbow patterns across the bulkheads. The drive core is consuming itself from the inside out. We have maybe 30 minutes before total cascade failure. 30 minutes to make 47 subjugated species understand that tyrants could bleed. Dr. Elisa Vorn had spent the journey to Thexmore, preparing her final gift to the galaxy. In the ship's biolabs, she'd cultivated something unprecedented, a crystalline organism that could survive in hard vacuum and reproduce by consuming the exotic materials used in hegemony military technology. Not dangerous to biological life, but absolutely lethal to the advanced alloys and energy systems that kept their war machine operational. "Beginning planetary bombardment," announced Rin Torch, her voice steady despite knowing she was describing the last military action humanity would ever take. The Vindication's weapons arrays had been modified beyond all recognition, combining human particle accelerators with alien plasma technology in configurations that should have been impossible. But impossibility had become humanity's signature. Instead of targeting military installations, the Vindication systematically destroyed the monuments to hegemony conquest that dotted Thexmore's surface, the crystalline towers that displayed trophies from exterminated civilizations, the museums that celebrated the Empire's genocidal expansion, the ceremonial grounds where conquered species were forced to pledge eternal servitude. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Across the hegemony empire, subject species watched their oppressor's capital world burn and began to whisper among themselves. If humans could reach the untouchable heart of the empire, what else might be possible? Commander Nexus monitored the cascading communications breakdowns across 47 star systems. "Sir, we're detecting spontaneous uprisings on 16 worlds. The Vorchan resistance movement has declared open rebellion. The Cathari mining collectives have gone on general strike. The hegemony's authority structure is collapsing faster than they can respond." Zerion felt a grim satisfaction. This had always been the true objective, not military victory, which was impossible with a single ship, but the destruction of the myth of hegemony invincibility. Every species in the galaxy would now know that the Empire could bleed, that their seemingly omnipotent overlords could be reached and hurt. "All hands, prepare for final phase," he announced over the ship's intercom. Around him, the bridge crew worked with mechanical precision, each officer understanding their role in humanity's last statement to the universe. The Vindication began its final approach to Thexmor itself, phase drive failing in spectacular cascades of exotic energy, weapon systems overloading from continuous fire, hull integrity compromising as jury-rigged components finally surrendered to forces they were never designed to contain. But they were close enough now. Close enough for the galaxy to witness what happened when a species chose defiance over extinction. In the depths of space, the crystalline organisms Dr. Vorn had created began to spread across the wreckage of destroyed hegemony vessels, multiplying exponentially as they consumed the advanced materials that kept the Empire's technology functional. Within hours, they would reach critical mass and begin spreading throughout the system, the beginning of the end for those who had dared to declare humanity extinct. The Vindication's final descent toward Thexmor became a cascade of impossible physics as the quantum phase drive tore itself apart in spectacular fashion. Reality bent around the dying ship, creating probability storms that turned hegemony interceptor squadrons into abstract art and transformed orbital defense platforms into flowering fractals of twisted metal. Emperor Vexthon Ultrax watched from his throne chamber as the human ship plunged through his capital world's atmosphere like a fallen star, trailing exotic energies that made the planet's twin suns flicker in sympathetic resonance. The impossible vessel had already eliminated 60% of the system's defensive grid using weapons that violated every known law of physics. "Status report from the Outer Rim territories," demanded the Emperor, his forearms gesturing frantically as he tried to maintain control of an empire suddenly convulsing with rebellion. Admiral Kexthan Mollix's holographic projection flickered, with interference from the probability storms raging through the system. "Your Imperial Magnitude, 17 systems have declared independence in the last 6 hours. The Cathari have seized control of the primary dilithium mines. The Vorchan resistance has captured 3 battle groups and turned them against our garrison. Forces. The Zephyrian colonies are broadcasting surrender terms to forces that no longer exist." The irony was devastating. Humanity's single surviving ship had accomplished what no military alliance had managed in 3 millennia. It had shattered the hegemony's myth of invincibility so thoroughly that the Empire was tearing itself apart. On the Vindication's bridge, Captain Zarion felt the deck plating buckle beneath his feet as structural supports failed throughout the ship. The view screen showed Thexmor's surface rushing up to meet them, its crystalline cities gleaming like scattered jewels against the planet's golden continents. "Hull integrity at 12%, reported Kayvon, his engineering station showering sparks as power conduits overloaded. "The quantum cascade is consuming the ship's molecular structure from the inside out. Estimate complete dissolution in 7 minutes. 7 minutes to complete humanity's final statement to the universe." Dr. Elisa Vorn worked frantically in her laboratory, surrounded by the crystalline organisms she'd spent weeks perfecting. These microscopic entities would be humanity's true legacy, not weapons of mass destruction, but catalysts of liberation that would systematically consume the hegemony's military technology while leaving biological life untouched. "Seeding complete," she announced over the comm system, her voice steady despite the ship's violent shaking. "The organism packages have been dispersed throughout the capital system. Conservative estimate suggests complete technological degradation within 72 hours. Throughout the galaxy, the effects were already becoming apparent. On worlds where the hegemony had scattered debris from their victories over human forces, the crystalline organisms were awakening and beginning their work. Every fragment of human technology that contained trace amounts of the special alloys Dr. Vorn had developed became a seed point for technological revolution. Commander Nexus monitored the cascading communication failures across the Empire. "Sir, the hegemony's faster-than-light communication network is experiencing systematic failures. Their military coordination is completely compromised." Conservative estimates suggest they've lost effective control over 60% of their territory. Rin Torch maintained her targeting protocols even as the ship disintegrated around her, systematically eliminating the symbolic centers of hegemony power on Thexmoor's surface. The crystalline monuments that celebrated the Empire's genocidal expansion became pillars of fire, while the ceremonial grounds where conquered species had been forced to pledge eternal servitude transformed into craters that would be visible from orbit for centuries. "All hands, this is the captain," Zerion announced, his voice carrying throughout the dying ship. "In approximately 4 minutes, the Vindication will complete its final mission. Every human being who ever lived can be proud of what we've accomplished here today. We have proven that tyrants can bleed, that empires can fall, and that a single ship filled with determined souls can change the course of galactic history." The ship's memorial hall had become a shrine to human defiance, its crystalline memory. Matrices recording the final thoughts and messages of 11,200 souls who had chosen to face extinction on their own terms. These recordings would survive the ship's destruction, eventually to be discovered by future generations of free species who would wonder at the courage of those who refused to surrender. As the Vindication entered its final approach to Thexmoor's surface, the quantum cascade reached critical resonance. The ship began to exist in multiple probability states simultaneously, becoming a ghost that haunted several versions of reality at once. The effect was spectacular and terrifying, a single vessel that appeared to be attacking from dozens of different vectors while existing in none of them completely. The hegemony's planetary defense grid, designed to repel conventional invasions, could not adapt to an enemy that phased in and out of existence while obeying no consistent laws of physics. Weapon systems targeting the Vindication found themselves shooting at probability ghosts, while the real ship remained untouchable until the moment it chose to solidify and strike. In the final seconds before impact, Captain Zerion activated the ship's ultimate weapon, not a device of destruction but of memory. Every human achievement, every work of art, every scientific discovery, every moment of love and loss and triumph was broadcast simultaneously across 47 star systems on frequencies that would echo in subspace for millennia. The message was simple and devastating. We were here, we lived, we loved, we defied extinction itself. Remember us. The Vindication's impact with Thexmoor's surface created a crater 17 kilometers wide and triggered seismic shock waves that shattered the planet's crystalline architecture for thousands of kilometers in every direction. But the true devastation was not geological. It was psychological, social, and technological, rippling outward through the hegemony empire at the speed of light and beyond. Within hours of the ship's destruction, Dr. Elissa Vorn's crystalline organisms had reached critical mass throughout the capital system. The microscopic entities, designed to consume only the exotic alloys used in hegemony military technology, began systematically dismantling the Empire's war machine from the molecular level up. Battleships found their hull plating dissolving into metallic dust. Orbital platforms watched their weapons arrays crumble into component atoms, and communication relays simply ceased to function as their quantum processors were consumed by organisms that treated advanced technology as food. Emperor Vexthon Ultrax stood in the ruins of his throne chamber, watching through cracked viewports as his orbital palace slowly disintegrated around him. The crystalline organisms had reached the station's structural supports, and the magnificent spires that had symbolized hegemony power for 3 millennia were collapsing into glittering powder. "Your Imperial Magnitude," his communications officer reported, her voice distorted by failing equipment, "We're receiving surrender broadcasts from 31 systems. The military governors are requesting immediate evacuation to worlds outside the contamination zone, but there were no uncontaminated zones. Every hegemony facility, every military installation, every technological center that had used materials salvaged from human battlefields was experiencing the same systematic dissolution. The Empire's military might was evaporating like morning mist, leaving behind only the raw materials from which it had been constructed. On the former slave worlds, the reaction was immediate and explosive. The Vorchan resistance, which had fought a losing guerrilla war for 2 centuries, suddenly found themselves facing hegemony occupation forces whose weapons no longer functioned and whose vehicles had dissolved into their component elements. Within days, entire sectors that had been under brutal military occupation for generations were declaring their independence. Kexthan Vril, the Vorchan resistance leader who had spent 40 years hiding in underground bunkers, stood in the ruins of the planetary governor's palace on Vorchan Prime and broadcast a message that reached every corner of what had once been the hegemony empire. "The humans gave us more than victory," she declared, her words carried by communication, networks that the hegemony could no longer control. "They gave us proof that oppression is not eternal, that tyrants are not invincible, and that a single act of defiance can transform the galaxy." The technological cascade was only the beginning. As hegemony military forces found themselves stranded on increasingly rebellious worlds with non-functional equipment, the Empire's administrative structure began to collapse. Governors who had ruled through terror discovered that without the threat of orbital bombardment, their authority evaporated overnight. The psychological impact was even more profound. For 3,000 years, the hegemony had maintained control through the myth of their own invincibility. Subject species had been conditioned to believe that resistance was futile, that the Empire's technological superiority made rebellion suicidal. The Vindication's impossible assault on Thexmore had shattered that conditioning so completely that some worlds declared independence before their local hegemony forces had even realized what was happening. On the research station orbiting Kepler 442b, one of the last human colonies to fall, xenoarchaeologist Nixon Templar made a discovery that would reshape galactic understanding of the human species. Deep in the station's data cores, she found records that the hegemony had suppressed, evidence that humanity had been systematically sharing their most advanced technologies with other species for centuries, disguising military aid as scientific collaboration. The stealth technology that had made the Vindication invisible, the quantum drives that allowed it to phase through solid matter, the exotic weapons that bypassed conventional shields. All of it had been developed through partnerships with species that the hegemony had later conquered. Humanity had been quietly building a network of technological resistance that spanned dozens of civilizations. "They knew," Nixhan whispered to her research team as they decoded file after file of suppressed communications. "The humans knew that the hegemony would eventually come for them, so they made sure their knowledge would survive their extinction. Revelation spread through academic networks that the hegemony's collapsing communication grid could no longer control. Species that had considered themselves technologically inferior discovered that their primitive technologies contained human innovations that had been hidden in plain sight for generations. Suddenly, civilizations that had seemed helpless against hegemony oppression found themselves possessed of weapons and defenses they had never known they had. The economic impact was equally devastating to the Empire. The hegemony's economy depended on the systematic exploitation of 47 species, with wealth flowing from the outer worlds to Thexmore and the other core systems. As rebellion spread and military control collapsed, that economic extraction ground to a halt. Core worlds that had never developed their own industrial capacity found themselves facing shortages of everything from food to breathable atmosphere. Within 2 weeks of the Vindication's destruction, the hegemony empire had effectively ceased to exist as a functional political entity. What remained was a collection of isolated worlds, their former oppressors either dead, fled, or desperately negotiating surrender terms with the species they had once enslaved. But the most profound change was cultural. Throughout the galaxy, the story of humanity's last ship had become a legend that transcended species barriers. Children of a dozen different civilizations drew pictures of the Vindication and left them at improvised memorials. Poets composed verses in languages humanity had never known existed. Scientists named newly discovered phenomena after human cities that no longer existed. The humans had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. They had transformed their own extinction into a force for liberation that continued to grow stronger even after their last ship had been reduced to atoms. 6 months after the Vindication's final flight, the former hegemony empire had transformed into something unrecognizable. Where once a single tyrannical authority had imposed order through fear and overwhelming military force, dozens of independent civilizations now struggled to define their relationships with each other and with the legacy of the extinct human species. The Vorshan Confederation, led by Kexthan Vril, had become the de facto coordinators of what historians were already calling the Liberation Wars. From their capital on the reclaimed world of Vorchan Prime, they broadcast daily updates on the status of former hegemony, territories, and coordinated humanitarian aid to worlds where the technological cascade had created serious infrastructure problems. The humans couldn't have known what their final act would unleash, Vril reported to the assembled representatives of 37 newly independent civilizations. But they gave us something more valuable than weapons or technology. They gave us proof that change is possible. The former Emperor Vexthon Ultrax had been captured trying to flee the core worlds in a primitive chemical rocket, all that remained functional after Dr. Elissa Vorn's organisms had consumed every piece of advanced technology on Thexmor. He now sat in a detention facility on Cathari Prime, awaiting trial for crimes against 47 civilizations. His 4 hearts barely functioned under the weight of understanding how completely his empire had collapsed. The technological cascade had stabilized after consuming every trace of the exotic alloys that the hegemony had used in their military hardware, but its effects continued to ripple through galactic civilization in unexpected ways. Species that had been deliberately kept at pre-industrial levels by their oppressors discovered that their primitive technologies contained sophisticated human innovations that had been disguised as indigenous developments. On the ocean world of Aquarius Tertius, the Mercon civilization found that their traditional coral-growing techniques actually incorporated human biotechnology that could produce materials stronger than titanium. The nomadic drifter clans realized that their ancient starship designs contained human navigation algorithms that made their vessels nearly impossible to track or intercept. The crystalline silicates discovered that their meditation practices activated neural interfaces that the humans had somehow integrated into their species' natural development centuries ago. Xenoarchaeologist Nix Han Templar had become something of a celebrity as she traveled from world to world, helping newly liberated species discover the hidden human technologies that had been secretly woven into their cultures. Her research had revealed the scope of humanity's long-term planning, a species-wide effort that had taken centuries to implement and had prepared for the possibility of their own extinction. The humans didn't just fight the hegemony, she explained, to a gathering of scientists on the former slave world of Kepler 186f. They planted seeds of resistance throughout the galaxy, technologies and ideas that would remain dormant until they were needed. They turned their own extinction into a trigger for galactic liberation. The memorial sites that had spontaneously appeared throughout former hegemony space had become something unprecedented. Pilgrimage destinations for multiple species who came to pay respect to a civilization they had never known. The crater on Thexmor, where the Vindication had made its final statement, had been declared neutral territory, maintained by volunteers from dozens of worlds who worked together to preserve the crystalline formations that had grown from the ship's exotic remains. But perhaps the most remarkable development was the discovery of the human archives. Hidden in asteroid belts, buried on uninhabited worlds, and embedded in the quantum structure of certain stars, humanity had scattered backup copies of their entire civilization throughout the galaxy. not just scientific knowledge or military technology, but art, music, literature, philosophical works, and historical records that painted a picture of a species that had been far more complex and nuanced than the hegemonies propaganda had suggested. The archives revealed that humanity had been systematically documenting the cultures and technologies of every species they encountered, not for conquest or exploitation, but for preservation. They had been the galaxy's librarians, quietly ensuring that the knowledge and achievements of dozens of civilizations would survive even if those civilizations were destroyed. Dr. Yexinara Flux, a silicate philosopher who had spent months studying the human archives, made an observation that would reshape galactic understanding of the extinct species. The humans were not warriors who occasionally created art. They were artists and philosophers and dreamers who occasionally had to fight. Everything they did, including their final battle, was an expression of their core belief that beauty and knowledge and freedom were worth any sacrifice. The Interspecies Council that formed from this new understanding was unlike any political entity the galaxy had ever seen. Instead of being based on military power or economic dominance, it was founded on the principle of mutual preservation. Each member species committed to ensuring that no civilization would ever again face extinction alone. The Council's first official act was to establish the Human Memorial Archive, a vast library ship that would travel between star systems, sharing the preserved knowledge of the extinct species and collecting the wisdom of living civilizations. The ship was constructed using technologies from a dozen different worlds, each contributing their most advanced innovations in honor of the species that had made their freedom possible. As the memorial ship prepared for its maiden voyage, representatives from 47 worlds gathered to witness the dedication ceremony. The ship bore no weapons. Its only armaments were the ideas, dreams, and accumulated wisdom of the human species, and all those they had inspired to seek freedom. The plague of tyranny that had infected the galaxy for 3 millennia was finally ending, replaced by something that no single species could have imagined. A community of civilizations united not by conquest or fear, but by the shared understanding that freedom was worth any price, and that even extinction could not silence those who chose to fight for what they believed. 1 year after the Vindication had carved its final statement into the surface of Thexmore, the galaxy had settled into a new configuration that defied every previous model of interstellar civilization. The Interspecies Council had grown to encompass 53 member worlds, each contributing unique technologies and perspectives to a collaborative effort that was reshaping the fundamental nature of galactic society. The Human Memorial Archive had completed its first circuit of the former hegemony territories, and the discoveries it had facilitated were staggering. On world after world, species were uncovering hidden aspects of their own cultures that revealed the extent of humanity's quiet influence over the centuries. The humans had not been conquerors or manipulators. They had been gardeners, carefully nurturing the growth of technological and cultural capabilities that would remain dormant until they were needed. Commander Rix Han Nova, the Cathari engineer, who had been chosen to captain the Memorial Archive, stood in the ship's central chamber and marveled at what they had accomplished. The chamber contained not just human artifacts and knowledge, but contributions from every species that had been liberated by the Vindication's final flight. It was becoming a living repository of galactic civilization, growing and evolving as new discoveries were made. "Status report from the Outer Rim territories," requested Nova, addressing the diverse crew that had volunteered for this unique mission. The Memorial Archives crew included representatives from 17 different species, all working together to preserve and share the wisdom of the dead and the living. Science Officer Taynara Crystal, a silicate whose crystalline form could interface directly with the ship's quantum storage matrices, provided the update. "We've confirmed the existence of human preservation sites in 47 additional star systems. The scope of their preparation is almost incomprehensible, They spent centuries seeding the galaxy with backup archives that would activate only after their extinction was confirmed. The implications were staggering. Humanity had not just planned for their own survival. They had planned for the survival of galactic civilization itself, ensuring that even if they were eliminated, the knowledge and technologies needed for other species to resist oppression would remain available. On the former capital world of Thexmore, now renamed Liberation in honor of its symbolic significance, construction was nearing completion on the memorial complex. The massive crystalline structures that had grown from the Vindication's exotic remains had been incorporated into a monument that was visible from orbit, its faceted surfaces refracting light in patterns that told the story of humanity's final battle in mathematical poetry that could be understood by any species with knowledge of physics. Kexthan Vril, now serving as the elected coordinator of the Interspecies Council, stood before the completed memorial as representatives from across the galaxy gathered for the dedication ceremony. The monument was more than just a tribute to the extinct human species. It was a promise that no civilization would ever again face extinction alone. Today, we dedicate this memorial not just to humanity, but to the principle they died defending, Vril announced, her words carried by quantum communication networks to every corner of the galaxy. The principle that freedom is worth any sacrifice, that tyranny can never be permanent, and that a single act of defiance can change the course of history. The ceremony was interrupted by an announcement that sent shockwaves through the assembled dignitaries. Deep space monitoring stations had detected something impossible, a faint signal originating from the galactic rim, carrying the distinctive quantum signature of human technology. Dr. Nixon Templar, now serving as the Council's chief xenoarchaeologist, reviewed the data with growing excitement. The signal is definitely of human origin, but it's not coming from any known preservation site. The quantum pattern suggests an active transmission from a functioning human facility. The implications were staggering. If humans had somehow survived their apparent extinction, if there were colonies or ships that had escaped the hegemony's systematic elimination, then everything they thought they knew about the species would need to be reconsidered. A joint expedition was organized within hours, composed of representatives from 12 different species and equipped with the most advanced technology the Council could provide. The Memorial Archive would lead the mission, its unique capabilities making it the ideal vessel for such a historic journey. As the expedition fleet prepared to depart for the galactic rim, a message arrived through the quantum communication network that left everyone stunned. It was a brief transmission from the source of the mysterious signal, and it contained just 7 words that would reshape galactic civilization yet again. "This is humanity. We're coming home," the signal originated. From beyond the galaxy's edge, from the vast intergalactic void where no civilization had ever ventured. Somehow, impossibly, part of humanity had survived, not by hiding or surrendering, but by doing what they had always done best, reaching further into the unknown than anyone thought possible. The Vindication had not been humanity's last ship, after all. It had been their declaration of war, their statement of principles, their gift to a galaxy that had written them off as extinct. But somewhere in the dark between galaxies, the rest of the human species had been preparing for a return that would complete what Captain Zirian Vex and his crew had begun. As the Memorial Archive led the expedition fleet toward the galactic rim, the quantum signals from beyond grew stronger and more complex. They weren't just transmissions, they were navigational beacons, guiding the expedition toward a rendezvous point that had been calculated with mathematical precision that defied comprehension. 3 days into the journey, the first visual contact was made. Emerging from the cosmic void like leviathans surfacing from an ocean of stars came ships unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Not the desperate, jury-rigged vessel that the Vindication had become, but purpose-built monuments to human engineering that had been constructed with resources and technologies that shouldn't have existed. The lead vessel identified itself as the Resurrection, and its captain was someone who should have been impossible. Admiral Zephyr Maelstrom, listed in hegemony records as killed during the siege of New Geneva 15 years earlier. "Citizens of the liberated galaxy," came her transmission, broadcast on frequencies that reached every inhabited world simultaneously. "We bring greetings from the human diaspora fleet. We have been watching, we have been preparing, and we have been waiting for the right moment to return." The story that unfolded over the following hours redefined everything the galaxy thought it knew about human nature and capability. The diaspora fleet represented the culmination of a 1,000-year plan that had begun long before the hegemony had even identified humanity as a threat. Recognizing that their expansionist nature would eventually bring them into conflict with galactic powers, human leaders had secretly dispatched colony ships beyond the galaxy's edge, not to flee, but to build. In the intergalactic void, free from the constraints of stellar gravity and traditional physics, human engineers had constructed something unprecedented. Mobile worlds that could sustain millions of people while traveling at speeds that made interstellar distances trivial. They had spent centuries developing technologies that treated space-time itself as a construction material, building civilizations that existed partially outside normal reality. The Vindication's sacrifice was not in vain, Admiral Maelstrom explained as the two fleets met in the space between galaxies. "Captain Vex and his crew gave us the intelligence we needed to complete our work. Every hegemony weakness they exposed, every tactical innovation they developed, every moment of fear they created, all of it was transmitted to us through quantum entanglement networks that your oppressors never detected." The returning humans were not the same species that had left the galaxy. Centuries of development in an environment where survival required thinking beyond conventional limitations had produced a civilization that operated on principles the galaxy was still struggling to understand. They had become something beyond traditional biology, their consciousness existing in quantum superposition states that allowed them to experience multiple realities simultaneously. But they had not forgotten their origins or their values. The HFY diaspora fleet carried with it detailed records of every human colony that had been destroyed, every family that had been eliminated, every child whose future had been stolen by hegemony aggression. They had come home not for conquest, but for completion, to finish what the Vindication had started and ensure that tyranny could never again threaten galactic civilization. The integration of the diaspora fleet into the new galactic order was seamless in ways that defied political theory. The humans didn't seek to reclaim their old territories or establish new ones. Instead, they offered their advanced technologies and accumulated wisdom to the Interspecies Council, asking only that they be allowed to help maintain the peace that their extinct kinsmen had died to create. The effect was transformational. Worlds that had struggled with the aftermath of hegemony collapse suddenly found their problems manageable with human assistance. Technologies that had seemed impossibly advanced became comprehensible with human guidance. Most importantly, the fear that had dominated galactic politics for millennia was replaced by something unprecedented, genuine cooperation between species that had previously seen each other only as competitors or threats. The Memorial on Liberation became a place of pilgrimage for both the living and the returned. Humans would stand before the crystalline formations that had grown from the Vindication's remains and commune with the quantum echoes of their fallen kinsmen, while representatives from dozens of other species came to understand the depth of sacrifice that had made their freedom possible. Dr. Elisa Vaughn's crystalline organisms, once symbols of technological warfare, had evolved into something beautiful, symbiotic entities that helped different species understand each other's thought, patterns, and cultural perspectives. The galaxy was becoming truly unified, not through conquest or assimilation, but through mutual understanding facilitated by the tools of cooperation that humanity had left behind. Years passed, and the legend of the Vindication grew beyond historical fact into something approaching myth. Children throughout the galaxy learned the story of humanity's last ship and the crew that chose defiance over extinction. Artists created works inspired by their sacrifice. Scientists named phenomena after the crew members who had died to ensure that freedom would survive. But perhaps the most fitting tribute was the simplest. Throughout the galaxy, on worlds that had never known human habitation, small monuments appeared bearing the same inscription in 100 different languages, in memory of those who chose to burn brightly rather than fade quietly. Their light still guides us home. The Vindication had become more than a ship, more than a symbol, more than a legend. It had become proof that in a universe where extinction was always possible, the choice to fight for something greater than oneself could create ripples that would reshape reality itself. Captain Zerion Vex and his crew had saved the galaxy not through military victory, but through the demonstration that some values were worth any sacrifice. In choosing to become a legend, they had ensured that tyranny would never again find the galaxy unprepared to resist. The stars themselves seemed brighter now, as if the universe had been fundamentally changed by the knowledge that even extinction could not silence those who chose to fight for freedom. Humanity's last ship had become their first gift to a galaxy that would never forget the price of peace or the power of defiance. In the end, they had achieved something that no conqueror in galactic history had ever managed. They had made themselves immortal not through force, but through the simple act of proving that hope could survive any darkness, and that one ship filled with determined souls could indeed change the destiny of the universe itself.